Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Adopting a Risk-Based Preventive Approach to Food Safety Across the End-to-End Cold Chain. This event, brought to you by Food Safety Magazine, is sponsored by Controlant. I'm your moderator, Barbara Van Renterhem, Editorial Director of the magazine. Thanks for joining us. Today's presenters are Dr. David Acheson, President and CEO of the Acheson Group, and Gisli Harjolfsson, co-founder and CEO of Controlant. Don't forget to submit your questions during the presentation. At the end of the program, our presenters will address as many of your questions as possible. Today's event is being recorded and will be archived on our website, foodsafetymagazine.com. So let's get started. To what degree does the supply chain pose a risk to food companies? David, how would you like to start us off?
Well, thank you, Barbara, and appreciate the invite to be part of this discussion. I think that this is kind of a key question, is looking at to what degree does supply chain pose a risk. I think for years we've recognized that suppliers can be a challenge, they can be difficult, and unquestionably they can pose risks. A factor that plays into that is over the last, I'd say, 10 years, we've recognized in the food industry that we're getting repeated recalls because of supply chain failures, if you like. When a problem occurs upstream in the supply chain, the knock-on effect can be significant. And historically, I think it was in probably the Peanut Corporation of America, the infamous PCA, that illuminated many failings in our food safety system. But without getting into the criminal side of that, one of the very obvious effects of that was the lack of understanding in the food industry about who is receiving from what. And why I say that is that situation which occurred early on in the year, I think it was 2009 when it popped up, maybe out by a year, apologies if I am, but when that began, we started to see recalls, and then they continued from the month of January through to June. By the time we were done, I think there were close to 4,000 recalls as a result of that event in a couple of plants. What that told us was there was a great deal of opacity in the supply chain. People simply didn't know who they'd sourced from, or they knew who their primary tier 1 supplier was, but not secondary. And yeah, we're buying peanut paste from a distributor. Obviously, the distributor isn't making it. Well, who are you getting it from? And are those risks being controlled upstream? And so that was very evident that supply chain can be a massive risk. And obviously have major economic consequences, major public health consequences if we don't get it right. And it was really that situation, more than anything, I think, that drove the requirements in the Food Safety Modernization Act to put supply chain controls in place. It was that sort of situation where it was like, geez, if you're using, in this example, a peanut paste to create a product, no matter what it is, you should have done an assessment on that and said, yeah, peanut paste, peanut butter could be a problem. It is a high-risk food in today's jargon. And what do we know about the way it's being controlled? So not only from a regulatory perspective, but also I think from a brand protection and an economic perspective, we've learned big time that understanding and controlling those risks in the supply chain is really critical. Sort of high-level view, but I'm sure Gisli's got some thoughts on that one too.
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, I think, and also to add to that is, just if you just look at media today, if there is an outbreak, everyone will know about it immediately, and then that's even contributing into, damaging your brand, than ever before, I would say. So, but I agree with everything that you said.
Do you think it's really enough to look at, one step forward, one step back in your supply chain? I mean, when you reference PCA and maybe you've checked out your distributor, but if the distributor hasn't checked one step back for that ingredient, is that recommendation really enough, or do we need to understand our entire supply chain from the very beginning to the end?
Well, let me jump on that one because you've just dangled that carrot out there, Barbara, and I'm going to go for it. Absolutely. I think it's this issue of how far back should you see is fundamental, and there's no doubt, there's no question. You need to see as far back as you need to see, and it's like, well, what does he mean? You need to understand the risks in your supply chain, and fundamentally, you need to understand who's controlling those risks, and that is, in a nutshell, the regulatory expectation from FDA with FSMA. One up, one back does not do that. And again, historically, the one up, one back requirement was part of the Bioterrorism Act from 2002. There was a real push when FSMA was being developed in 2007 and 2008, early days of discussions with the Hill, to actually require full pedigree traceability. And there were even earlier versions of FSMA, particularly coming out of the House, in which there was a requirement for full pedigree traceability within 2 business days. And there was essentially a gasp of horror from the private sector. It's like, oh my goodness, we couldn't possibly do that. It's not technically feasible. It's not economically feasible. It just simply can't be done. And yet, at the time, as a regulator as I was then, it was like, that's exactly what we need. And I hate to bring up the thorny problem of was it tomatoes or was it peppers, going back again that same era, which will resonate with you for sure, and probably Gisli and others. And there we were going totally down the wrong road for weeks. Why? Because the traceability systems didn't work. Once they sort of got lined up, it was like, oh, it doesn't look like it is the tomatoes because it doesn't fit. Then what is it? And you sort of launch into it something else, and you go figure out what it actually was. But that was a disaster economically for the tomato industry, and it was that failure of full visibility and good traceability. And I know this isn't a blockchain webinar, but it's like it's the inevitable. Okay, is blockchain the answer? And I'm just going to leave that one dangling out there for somebody to pose later, because I'm not going to jump into it. But no, indeed, I think we need that. We do need full. We need full, whether it's regulatory required or not. A food company really does need to know where they're getting their ingredients, primary packaging, or finished products from that they're using in something that they're making, and who's controlling those risks.
Right. And then now you dangled the carrot in front of me when you mentioned the tomatoes and peppers. So don't you think, and we could have an entire webinar on produce traceability, but don't you think produce in particular poses an interesting challenge? Because by the time you trace something back, more often than not, that product is not being harvested anymore, or it's been pulled off the shelf already because it has a short shelf life. So, any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. And I think that sort of tracks into produce. I mean, I'm treading on Gisli's territory here, but produce typically needs to have its temperature controlled, either for safety and or quality. So I think that from the point of harvest to the point of receipt, we do a not a good job with produce. It loses its visibility as it gets repacked and sorted and sized and whatever as it's working its way down. And I know it's economically a massive challenge to do that effectively. And it as we've learned, unfortunately, we learned that lesson. I'm going to go even further back than tomatoes with spinach in 2006. Mm-hmm. And sadly, the romaine outbreak this year, as we have seen from Scott Gottlieb and others at FDA, is like, what have we learned? Why isn't this working? And it's like that's just a total echo of what was said in 2006, which led to the Produce Tracing Initiative, which to some extent did some good stuff. But Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think having a webinar on the challenges of produce traceability would be a really good idea, because it has to be a team approach. If we wait for the regulators to tell us what to do, we won't like it, and yet there has to be a recognition as to what's economically feasible and public health oriented, and in today's environment is moving quickly enough so brands aren't getting decimated as people are sort of walking away from a whole commodity, which is what we saw with romaine, it's what we saw with spinach, it's what we saw with tomatoes. All right. We're going to have a bit of a polling question here, and so everybody who's joined us, please take a look at the question. And the question is, do you have concerns about your supply chain from a food safety perspective? And either it's a yes or it's a no answer. So do you have concerns about your supply chain from a food safety perspective? So, Gisli, what do you think? Do you think people should have concerns, or is everybody in a good place?
Well, I think, you don't know what you don't know. And I think, if you don't have concerns now, I'm sure you will have it once you have an incident. And as we have seen a lot of those, as we mentioned before. So I think, I think it's definitely a concern.
Right.
And even more now than ever.
Yeah, right. No, and there are very few companies that I've worked with who feel completely buttoned up on supply chain. It's always causing some challenges. So, what do we get there on the results? Well, 75% said yes, and 25% said nope. Their supply chain is good. I'd love to challenge those 25% and sort of say, well, are you sure? But anyway, good and interesting polling question. Let's move on to our next question.
So what are some of the biggest challenges around managing supply chain risks? David, you want to start us off with that one again?
Yeah, I'm absolutely. I think we've touched on some of these already, Barbara, and I think that some of the biggest challenges is the fundamental one of who is in my supply chain. You know who your tier one is, i.e., who you are buying something from. It gets a little vague when you go to tier two. It's like, who are they buying it from? And as it works its way further along the supply chain, it can get more and more challenging. So I think number one is frankly who is in the supply chain. Then number two, you should have, certainly if you're an FDA regulated facility, you should have done a risk assessment. That obviously doesn't apply to retail and food service, but manufacturers and processors need to do a risk assessment to say, in the products, ingredients, primary packaging I'm receiving, what are those risks and who is controlling them? And obviously that requires you to know who is up there. So the risk assessment part isn't a huge challenge. Who's in the supply chain, just physically, who's touching the product, is a challenge. And then I think another massive challenge, which we touched on talking about PTI, is how do you then manage that risk? You've determined there's risks all over the place, or there's a few risks in certain key areas, but how do you manage that risk in a cost-effective way? And many, if not all, food companies struggle with that. Companies don't have the resources to send their QA team out to all the suppliers. They may send them out to a few key ones, and I think that's part of where we're learning today is the way to manage that challenge is truly approach it from a risk-based perspective. We kind of know what the theoretical risks are. Yeah, there could be salmonella in that ingredient. How's that being controlled? Is this something that is being used widely in my company? In other words, that ingredient is going into every single product I make. So if that supplier makes a mistake, I'm in lots of trouble. So there's a number of ways of looking at the inherent risk of the ingredient, the supplier behavior. It's like, oh yeah, they're a great supplier, they're totally compliant, they're always on time, they meet their specs 100%, versus the supplier who's just had their third 483 from FDA and has had 6 recalls in the last 5 years, and you sort of don't feel quite so good about them. So that's a sort of an example of supplier behaviors. And then obviously what you're doing with the product is critical too. So the challenges are like who's in the supply chain, what are the risks, and increasingly today, how do I manage that risk in a cost-effective way? Because it does come down to economics. Gisli, what do you see as challenges in the supply chain?
Yeah, and I agree. Obviously, there are many stakeholders, and there's also high, employee turnover in the industry, and so training and retraining is cumbersome, and I think that having the ability to be able to measure quality constantly is very important. You might go on a site and do an inspection, and then you might see an increased quality, but then after a quarter or two, it starts to reduce again. So I think it's also very important that you're able to measure it, however you do it, effectively.
Yeah.
Gisli, I'm struck, if I can take a minute, maybe you could speak a little bit to the fact that the supply chain is global. And there are obviously some challenges maintaining cold chain when you're shipping beef from Japan, for example. So what are your thoughts about just the global nature of the chain and what challenges exist?
Yeah, absolutely, and as we all know, the world is getting smaller, but it's also getting more complex, and so consumers are obviously demanding fresh ingredients all year round. Even though traditionally it was a seasonal product, you still want to get it all year round, and that obviously means that you have to start sourcing those for different regions. And I think if I remember correctly, more than 50% of fruits are actually being imported into the States. So yeah, this has definitely changed, and there you might obviously have completely different regulations and processes and culture. So it is a challenge. Absolutely.
So we have another polling question up, and this one gets at blind spots. So again, a yes/no answer. Do you have blind spots in your supply chain? And where we're trying to go with that one is going back to the point that Barbara asked about, was full traceability, and the comment that you generally know you should know who your immediate tier 1 supplier is, but how far back can you see? So kind of general question here is do you have blind spots? And if you do, check the yes box. And based on the previous polling question, I'm thinking those 25% who had their supply chain all stitched up don't have blind spots. But hopefully we're making you sort of just think a bit. It's like, ooh, maybe I do. But do you see blind spots as a challenge, Gisli?
Yes, and I sometimes, I've asked, kind of quality manager, what keeps you up at night? And they always have things that keeps them up at night. Very common answer is, the last mile piece is where you kind of lose a lot of visibility in in that area of your supply chain. So yes, I think there are definitely blind spots that keep people up at night.
Well, there we see the results popping up on the screen. 85% of the folks on the call said, yeah, we got blind spots, and 15% said no, they don't. I just one sort of anecdotal comment on this is a number of years ago I was working with a very large company who'd had an issue with some frozen entrees they were making, and it was a salmonella issue. And what the end result was that it looked like it could have been a number of ingredients that was responsible for this. And they tracked it back to one of their ingredients, and as being by far away the most likely, and there was a lot of evidence to support it was indeed that ingredient based on the epidemiology of the illnesses. And so they went back to their supplier and said, this looks like your ingredient was the problem. And this was a really good supplier, no blind spots, totally buttoned up. and the supplier sheepishly admitted, well, with that lot that we shipped, we were short, and we had to go and get product from somebody else, which actually was contractually not allowed. So there were obviously consequences to that, but that's how that panned out. So even when you don't think you've got blind spots, sometimes suppliers will create those blind spots for you because you are a really important customer, and they are not going to short you, because if they short you, you're going to go start to look for somebody else. So they won't short you, but sometimes they'll be putting not shorting you as a higher priority on making sure that the product is safe. It certainly was being all done in the spirit of good intent, and the supplier believed that who they were sourcing from was okay, but it turns out that they weren't. But so sometimes blind spots can creep up on you without you even knowing it.
All right. Gisli, maybe you can take this next question. What is the cold chain, and why is it so complex today?
Yeah, sure. Well, in a nutshell, the cold chain is a segment of the supply chain where temperature-sensitive goods need to be maintained under strict temperature conditions, from the start of the journey until the end destination. So that means that, any break in the cold chain can affect food quality, freshness, safety, and which, not only affects the consumer health and safety, but also impacts, your business bottom line. And with perishable products, temperature is essential to ensure quality and safety. Time, money, and health are of the essence. And this applies to variety of products. Fresh foods, vegetables, meat products, and even frozen. And even products that don't necessarily pose a high risk, like ice cream or chocolate, will still lose its value in the eyes of the consumer if it's not managed correctly, and can really hurt your brand image. So that's just wherever you need to control temperature is the cold chain. But it's also very complex, like you asked a question earlier about globalization, stuff like that. So obviously we are, consumers are demanding a lot of things today. They are requiring freshly sourced, even exotic foods, and that means that you might be sourcing, all kinds of products from, spices from India, berries from Chile, avocados from Mexico, and whatever. And talking about tomatoes, they may be, been regionally sourced in Mexico, co-mingled in California, and brokered before reaching, any restaurant chain. So, all year round access to fresh produce, means that, as I said earlier, you need to source it from far away, from different regions, based on season. And that means that, your supply chain is constantly changing, and that's obviously a huge challenge. So I think that, especially in the cold chain, temperature monitoring and control becomes truly a mission critical to, ensure food safety and highest quality. So as we know, that the cold chain is not just about moving products from A to B. It's more complex than that, with multiple stakeholders. And talking about blind spots, there are obviously a lot of blind spots, especially in the cold chain. You have ports, you have airport tarmacs, where your foods might be waiting to be moved on in the journey, and if you don't have visibility into what's happening with your product, then again that's a blind spot, and you are not able to intervene or protect the product or from being wasted. So you don't know what you don't know, and then it's really hard to fix those weak spots or blind spots. But and then again, you have contractors, subcontractors, and it's sometimes difficult to get a clear overview of how they operate, how they are actually managing your, temperature-sensitive products, and high employee turnover rate makes it even more challenging. So if you don't have a constant kind of like measurement on the performance of your cold chain, you might be running into a problem. Anything you want to add to that, David?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, again, sort of looking at it through a regulatory lens, is that was really what the sanitary transport rule was about. I mean, recognizing that it only applies to rail cars and trucks, and it's domestic focused, this sort of regulatory recognition that maintaining temperature is a critical part of safety. I mean, there's other components to that rule, obviously, but again, it's sort of recognizing that there's failures in the system, and so setting clear regulatory standards and inspecting transport to that level is a key part of protecting the food supply. But yeah, it's complex for sure on the cold chain.
Now, what are the primary challenges in working with perishable food and beverage products? Gisela, you want to start us off with that one?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, food businesses in general are facing kind of like, primary challenges like, margins, accountability, and also just communication and trust with stakeholders. So, obviously margin is the obvious one, and then anything you can do to, reduce shrink, could increase shelf life, for example, have a good temperature control, and reduce delays in your delivery is very important, and anything you can do to prevent, product recalls and its downstream effects will also affect your bottom line greatly. And, if a load of meat is lost, it must be replaced, cost increase, and it can take months to settle any kind of like product rejections, which kind of like leads to accountability, because accountability is also very complex, and it's really difficult to pinpoint often who is responsible if something goes wrong, and, who has to pay for the truck of poultry that, went bad. And, and I can just give you kind of like, to put this into a perspective, and this is, based on just current setup. You have a restaurant chain who is working with multiple stakeholders, just focusing on the primary supply chain. They have producers, they have a logistics company, and the logistics company have, subcontractors, and then they work with distribution centers as well to source and then do the last mile delivery. So let's say, for example, one of the distribution centers does a spot check of a product that has been, was just arriving, and they found out that temperature is out of spec, and they reject the load. Then you need to find out what was, the cause and who is accountable. Now, the trucking company, can give you temperature readings, from the reefer unit, and they will probably say that the temperature reading was just fine, so they're not to blame. But it's not that easy, because the thing is that, temperature readout, for example, from a reefer unit only gives you what the temperature was in the front of the trailer, unless you kind of like have an optimal setup and perfect airflow in the trailer. But that's not really how, the real world works. And, we have done a lot of temperature mapping studies where we're seeing that the difference between these readouts from a reefer units compared to the actual ambient temperature in back of the trailer can exceed 20 degrees, and typically is around 10 degrees. So even though you get the temperature readout from a trucking company, it doesn't necessarily tell you what the actual temperature was during the route. And there are also, and then there, to make it even more complex, there might be multiple reasons why you're seeing discrepancy from a readout from a reefer unit as opposed to the actual product temperature upon delivery. I mean, a truck driver might be saving fuel by putting the reefer unit on a power saving mode, which is okay for mild conditions, but as soon as the temperature outside gets above 70 degrees, you will start to see a lot of deviation. Well, the good thing is that, you can actually change the settings to go from a power saving mode to more continuous mode. And if you have a real-time, information about the status of your product, it's an easy fix. But in many cases, that's not why, the problem lies. It can be that you have improper airflow in the trailer. And the thing is that has nothing to do with the trucking company, because it's the responsibility of the producer to load the truck. And so then where does the responsibility lie if that is truly the case? And then the final thing is that if the product temperature was not at the right temperature at the production side, there is kind of like sometimes a misconception that, for example, a refrigerated truck is able to control your product temperature. The best it can do is actually to maintain it, not control it. So, So even just for one shipment where you have this problem, you will see that finding the accountability is a complex thing, and you definitely want to avoid the blame game, which kind of like leads to the trust thing, the communication and trust between stakeholders. And I can maybe just give you one example that I remember. I remember an incident where kind of like lack of trust was an issue. It was a truckload of fresh produce, a 5-day trip, and on the first day the temperature suddenly changed and went well above allowable limits. So my team reached out and we were told that the driver stopped and looked at the refuel unit and said that everything was perfect. Okay, fine, but then the temperature kept rising, and the following day we asked for another inspection, the same answer, but the temperature still continued to increase. And by that time, the trucking company was getting a little bit frustrated. They were like, why don't you trust an expensive reefer unit rather than a cheap plastic temperature logger, as they said it. So we just had to let it go, even though we knew that something was going on. And a few days later, we got an email with images showing that what had happened. Half of the boxes had tilted over and completely collapsed, stopping all airflow, temperature started to rise, and etc. So, of course, the load was rejected, and the blame game started. Did the driver do something that caused this? Was the product not securely loaded at production site, etc.? And I remember thinking, like, we could see from far away that there was a problem, while the driver standing next to the product could not see it and had no clue. So and we also think that, like, okay, if we had maybe communicated better to all the relevant stakeholders, kind of like the meaning of the program, why there can be a difference between a reefer unit readout and the actual product temperature, and especially if you would kind of like have been able to build a better trust between all the stakeholders, we might be have able to save maybe 90% of the load, or at least not wasted a 5-day trip across the country and 7 days delay in resupply. So communication and trust is key in my mind.
Great. David, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't. Not on that one. That was good answer.
So, David, why don't you take the next question? What are some of the basic approaches a food company can take to manage their supply chain risks?
Oh, yes. That's potentially a very broad answer. But I think, to try to boil it down to essentials, and to some extent, Barbara, we've covered a number of these points already, but let me try to put them together. I think step one is, from a purely practical perspective, is create a list of ingredients, primary packaging, and finished products that you may be using. And by finished products, the example that I would use there is, you may be a company that makes burritos, and you create the filling for the burrito from scratch. So whatever, the beans, the rice, the meat, whatever it is, you're cooking that all up, but you put it into a tortilla yourself. You don't make the tortilla, which obviously is a multi-ingredient product. So that's what I mean by a product. So create that list. Also keep in mind that list needs to include not just the ingredients, the products, and the primary packaging, but also the locations of those suppliers. Because you may be buying an ingredient from a big international company, and they're actually shipping you ingredients from 5 of their different facilities. So you do need it on a facility basis. So that's simply creating, okay, who's in the mix. And FDA's perspective of that is all of those need to be approved suppliers. So what do we mean by an approved supplier? So that gets into the second part of the to-do, which is you then have to do a risk assessment on all of those products, ingredients, packaging, and make a determination of is there a risk that we need to control, sort of using the fundamentals of risk analysis. Getting to the point where, and this is where you need somebody who knows what they're doing, a preventive control qualified individual type leveled person should know, is that a risk that we need to control or is it not? If it's a purely theoretical risk, then forget it. The next part of that is when you've done your risk assessment. So, like, what's my list? Where's the risks? Number 3 is, are any of those risks a class 1 level risk? And if they are, then FSMA, if you're under FDA, is going to require you to get an on-site audit. And part of all of this process, as you're looking at those ingredients and packaging and products, etc., is to ask yourself a question as you're going along with all of this is, we've got a risk. Who's controlling that risk? Is it the supplier? Is it me? Or is it my customer? And it's typically going to be one of those 3. And if it's you controlling the risk, it's important that you've identified the risk. You're controlling the risk, it becomes part of your food safety plan and internal risk control strategies. If the customer is controlling the risk, then obviously there's some regulatory requirements in terms of informing the customer that you haven't processed the product to control specific hazards. And if it's the supplier controlling the risk, then there is the obligation to go and verify that that risk is being controlled. So it's a complex question with multiple pieces, but simply, who do I need to worry about? Where are the risks? Are any of them class 1 is a key thing. And then who's controlling the risk? And figuring that out as to the strategies around that. But, you know, you can boil it down to simplicity, but FDA is starting to focus heavily on these sorts of things. And are you doing it right? Is the risk right? And particularly, are you verifying that those risks are being controlled by the supplier? But
now, you mentioned about, you know, sanitary transportation, and there is some confusion whose responsibility it is to check what. So, you know, there needs to be, you know, some clarification on, you know, now that this rule is out there, how responsibilities have changed. It's just something that popped into my head as you were speaking. So.
Yeah. No, you're right. And you know, the sanitary transport rule that I touched on does actually impact all sorts of individuals. And the final version of the rule broke it into 4 chunks. It's you know, are you the shipper, the entity that's causing the goods to be moved? Are you the loader? Self-explanatory. Are you the person putting it on the truck? Are you the carrier? You're moving it around, or are you the receiver? And that touches a lot of the supply chain. And so you know, the sanitary transport rule requires you to look at those pieces and make that sort of determination.
Right. If we move on to our next question, Gisli, if you would like to tackle this one, what technologies are having the greatest impact on developing an effective risk mitigation program?
Yeah, sure. Instead of, you know, maybe going into, you know, technical details, maybe I'll just focus on what you're actually gaining out of the technology. And you know, I always say that having the right information at the right time, you know, gives you the head start you need to make, you know, successful improvements. And technology certainly plays a big part in providing that information. So, I mean, there are, you know, obviously a lot of devices and solutions out there that can measure, you know, for example, a variety of environmental factors. But in my mind, the 3 most important things, you know, are knowing the temperature of a product and its location, and then having it in real time. And, you know, being able to collect all of these data points with, you know, minimum human efforts and irrespective of the modes of transportation, logistics company, packaging, and so on. And really having a data that gives you an objective view on your supply chain performance, you know, at all times. And in my mind, that's really powerful because not only are you able to notify stakeholders immediately about the problem, why there's a problem, where it's occurring, so they can take a preventative action and reduce waste, but you're also able to collect, you know, data that starts to give you a much clearer picture on what's happening in your supply chain. You start to see, you know, these blind spots, and I can, you know, maybe give you one example. I'll try to make it brief. So we have we had food company that had a problematic lane, where they were sourcing fresh produce from, California, delivering it to Florida. So, it's about a 5-day trip, but by only collecting temperature data, they could see that they were experiencing temperature deviation in 27% of trips, and they could see the average lead time of 5.6 days. And but once they started to collect temperature and location data, they saw things that they couldn't see before. Well, first of all, they saw that the drivers were making their own decision on which route to take on this lane, and they were taking mainly two routes. One was through the Death Valley, and the other one was through LA. Okay, fair enough. You might want to avoid the traffic in LA, but actually going through the Death Valley in the middle of a summer with a temperature-sensitive product is maybe not the best idea. And needless to say, we could see that when they took the route through the Death Valley, in 40% of occurrences you had temperature deviations, when you only had 14% deviation when you go through LA. And since you already have the location data, you're also able to measure through door-to-door, kind of like delivery time. And actually, the interesting thing is that actually the route that took them through LA was a little bit shorter time-wise. So there was no reason for anyone to go through the Death Valley, and they could make a very easy decision. So, but now they knew, and I just looked at the data from this summer, and there was no deviation reported in this lane, and they had actually reduced the delivery time by more than 24 hours. So that's why I say it's so powerful to just having temperature and location and being able to have it in real time is a really powerful tool. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is not, it's not all about the information. You need to have a scalable solution. Now, for example, this particular company has about 300 lanes in their primary distribution and 30,000 truckloads. So there's no way for a company of that size to manage kind of like a risk mitigation program unless it's extremely scalable. So you might have the best technology, but if it's too complicated to use, it won't be successful. You may have 60 producers, and people need to be trained and retrained on how to use the solution. It needs to fit into existing processes, and you need to be able also to have consistency in the data. So that means that you need to have countermeasures for any human errors and stuff like that. So it's so I think that's is another thing. Information scalability, and then kind of like in order to make the program work for you, you need to have kind of like an exception-based solution, or a program where you're only being notified, where there are problems that you need to deal with. You don't want to be manually inspecting 30,000 temperature records where maybe 95% of them were within limits. You can have a system doing that, but you want to focus your effort on those 5%. Get to the root cause, and next year it won't be 5%; it will be 2.5%, and etc. So, I think in my mind, what technology is. It's more about what the technology gives you, and that is information and but just make sure it's very scalable and kind of like exception-based.
Excellent. Now our next question, David, if you'd like to tackle this one. We've talked a lot about what the challenges are for cold chain, but what are the main challenges for actually implementing those interventions that we've talked about?
I think let's assume we know who's in the supply chain, Barbara, which, as we discussed, is a challenge in and of itself.
Right.
I've seen that one of the biggest challenges is companies, particularly food and beverage companies, working on high volumes and narrow margins. It's like, what's the return on investment here? And as Gisli's pointed out, sometimes you have a massive cost because you haven't followed up on data, or you haven't controlled time temperatures appropriately, and you've just lost the whole load and wasted 5 days of transport and all the costs associated with it. So I think where we struggle, and this gets back to just end-to-end traceability, is where's the ROI on that? And we have to build it around savings in quality and logistics. Simply sort of saying, well, if you have a problem, then you'll know where everything is. doesn't happen enough to be the driver. There's got to be other ROIs built into it, and I think that's, again, as an industry, we need to be looking at we need to be looking at this broadly across industry, regulators, as well as technology providers to come up with solutions. If there's no ROI, people won't pay for it. It does boil down to dollars, for sure.
Right. So the last question before we go to the Q&A is, how should businesses get started with developing a preventive food safety program for their supply chain? Gisli, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, maybe if I focus more on the technical side of things there. Of course, you need to have a very clear what is the purpose of the program and outcome and etc. But if you look at kind of like on a technology standpoint and how, for example, I have been working with our customers, is that you just you can start by doing kind of like a trial or a study. It's very easy to start just kind of like letting devices flow through your supply chain, and then they can automatically record, kind of like give you a spot check on some of the weak points, and you don't have to do a lot of kind of like shipments to kind of like start to see a picture on where maybe some of the problematic areas are, and that will truly help you make a decision on where you should start implementing, and that also you can use that data also to kind of like measure success and share with your stakeholders. And that helps you to get a buy-in moving forward. If you do this properly, they will see the light, they will see what you're doing, and more likely to embrace it. And obviously, when you're then implementing your rollout plan, do it with your stakeholders. Have them involved. That's gonna bring you more success, making sure that everyone is trained and etc. So I think that's just you can start easy, but very, very soon you will be able to figure out where are my biggest risk points, and then you can start focusing there during your rollout phase, sort of.
Anything to add, David?
No, I don't. No, I think that was. Normally I have something to say, but I'm anxious to see what other questions we may have from our audience, Barbara.
That sounds great. So now we'll turn it over to our presenters to answer some of the questions that have come in, and we have quite a few. So the first one is, do you think management is on board with managing risk through their supply chain, or are they still on the old low-cost delivery buddy system with their primary suppliers?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. I think it's a mixed bag. And there's nothing like a red-hot recall or a crisis from a supply chain failure to get the C-suite to focus on reducing that risk. And until that happens, there's often, what can we do to save costs on supply chain? But once it does happen, there is a sort of change of behavior pattern as the consequences can be massive. So I think it is a mixed bag, which sort of circles back to what we've discussed already a little bit, is, what's the ROI? And as Gisli's pointed out, and can give more examples, I'm sure, is often with food, it's a quality issue. You extend shelf lives, or you reduce waste and loss of product because you're controlling the temperatures as you're moving things up and down the supply chain. But I think leadership struggle with this. It seems like an empty investment for purely food safety, and yet when that bad day happens, you wish you'd had it in place. So we have to look for multiple returns on that investment, Barbara.
Yeah, it's too bad we can't get adoption of those programs as a preventive measure. More often than not, it's reactive. So as you say, if you've been through a recall and have lost money, that's when you're more likely to make sure that that those programs are in place going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So next question, how do you handle proprietary or trade secret information?
I'm going to let Gisli handle that one.
Yeah, that's actually it's a very, 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 very good question, and then that obviously, at least for my company, obviously that has to do with just to start with the culture of the company and respecting the privacy, making sure that all of our employees have contracts where this is clearly stated, but and then also we. Typically, yes, we actually are collecting a lot of valuable information, but we try to stay out of the trade secret thing as much as possible. Just as it can be a risk, but we have agreements and contracts with all of our customers where this is all kind of like tackled. So, if that answers the question.
Well. We'll see if we get another question from that participant today. And this is a question that we touched on a little bit, but how can you control risks when your suppliers are out of the country? So getting back to the complicated global supply chain.
Well, from a technical standpoint, that's just it's not that complicated, if you have selected a technology vendor that operates globally, then you will be able to have basically real-time data about everything in your supply chain, disregardless of where it is in the world, whether it's a beef from Australia or whatever. So technology is really helping there, and so.
Yeah, that's important for everyone to keep in mind, that crosses borders quite easily, the technology.
Okay. Absolutely.
Next question. Have you experienced an increased request for help managing shipments that have been rejected for out-of-spec temperatures? So is the temp of the actual product taken and considered, so beyond either the product case or the reefer? Or is the time that the product has been out of spec considered? So how do you go about looking at the out of spec?
Yeah. Yes, of course, and as I stated earlier, it's you will get different readings where you go from a reefer unit or for example a locker that is measuring the ambient, and I think it's very common that a product temperature is done upon receiving, especially in the primary distribution, and you need to consider that as well. But also, if you are continuously monitoring temperature, you will be able to, for example, you can create matrices for different food categories on the allowable limit, both temperature-wise and time-wise. And we also operate a lot in pharma, and pharma in a way is a little bit simpler because pharma has just decided on what is the single truth of everything, and that is the data from the temperature logger. So they make their decisions purely based on that. But that's easier to deal with in a way.
Right. Now, has predictive modeling been considered an acceptable tool to support the safety of product?
Yes, of course it is. I mean, when we set up, for example, for a supply chain, we set it up so that. For example, we are notified before a deviation occurs, and there are multiple methods on how you can actually predict on things. So yes, predictive modeling is quite useful, and we will be using more of that in the future for sure.
Now, we've talked about the temperature of products in the truck, but if you have a pallet of product that's been shrink wrapped, for example, what is your approach to measuring the temperature of that load? You have possibly quite a gradient across that whole pallet. So what are some suggestions for how someone could manage that risk?
Yeah, I mean, that's always going to be, you have to base it on science and data in a way. A pallet, if a pallet sits on a tarmac and the side that actually is facing towards the sun is going to be much warmer than the other side. But you also need to be careful of cost and complexity. And it can be really complex to be putting temperature devices on a pallet level. But if you are, for example, if you're doing a truckload, it should be quite sufficient to have two measurement devices, one in the front and one in the back. And as I said, we've done multiple studies where we show that that's kind of like it's giving you the upper and lower limit on what's happening there. But if your shipment is likely to be split up, like in air freight, if you want to completely, get rid of blind spots, you might consider putting a device on a pallet level. But if your shipment is not being split up, you can use fewer devices and kind of like go with a little bit less complexity.
Mm-hmm. Now this is quite a complicated question, so I will do my best to ask it. If you have a product, and this person used a dairy powder as an example, in one case a customer could control the biological hazard, in another case they can't. If they have called out the environmental control program as a preventive control, and it has been used with no additional treatment to control the biological hazard, is it acceptable to use the environmental control as the control for the hazard, or I'm not even sure I know how to, and the person said they're struggling with how to ask the question clearly, but I think that if you have some instances where a hazard's control and others not, is it a matter of you really have to dig down to see what the best intervention is or the critical control point that you're using in that process?
Let me try to answer that one, Barbara. I suspect where the question is going is leading you down the road is if there's a risk in a product, what are the processes of controlling that risk? And certainly part of your risk assessment for your food safety plan needs to be, is there a risk post-processing from an environmental contaminant? That's a separate question. If there is, that risk has to be controlled through an environmental control program and from a FSMA perspective, an environmental monitoring program to verify the control program is working. That's a risk that would be introduced post-process. If it's some sort of powdered milk, then obviously there are other risks associated with that have got nothing to do with environmental contamination. They've got things to do with, was the product properly pasteurized? Were there other ingredients added? Is the processing working? If it's been spray dried, and that's being determined as a kill step, which sometimes it is that validated? So it's kind of trying to break it into two parts. But an environmental control program per se is controlling the environmental risks. It's not controlling the inherent product risks. So if that's getting at where that questioner was going, then great. If not, I think our contact information is there, so do feel free to reach out to either one of us, and we'll try and help you some more. Yeah,
it looks like it's the point of whether that ingredient is used like before or after an intervention that would, a kill step, for example. So if you do the environmental control after the kill step, is that enough then?
In combination with a validated kill step, yes, it should be, because you've got a kill step, however you define that, or you're controlling the risks through a preventive control, which let's say is some sort of a heat treatment, and then you link that to a post-processing environmental control strategy. That is essentially what you would need to do, put the two together.
Right. We're out of time for more questions, but rest assured, if you did submit a question, the speakers will be able to reach out and answer those after this session today. So please join me in thanking Dr. David Acheson and Gisli Harrelson for their presentation, as well as our sponsor, Controlant. If you have additional questions or comments, don't hesitate to click the Email Us button on your console and provide us with some feedback for today's webinar. We also have a survey that'll pop up, and we'd love for you to take a couple of minutes to complete the survey as we welcome your detailed remarks. Please visit our website at foodsafetymagazine.com for an archive of this presentation, as well as information about our upcoming events. We hope you found this webinar to be a valuable experience today. Thank you.